Diary 2. The March to the East and the Winter of 1941 at 42. Publisher's note. What remained unknown to Hans Roth when he participated as part of his division in the bloody battles for Kiev was the fierce debate in the German Army's High Command, which had far-reaching consequences on the course of the Barbarossa Plan and, ultimately, on the outcome of World War II as a whole. By the beginning of August, von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group of Army Group South had advanced 150 kilometers along the lower reaches of the Dnieper, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group of Army Group Center had advanced eastward by about the same amount, but northward to the east of the Dnieper in its upper reaches south of Smolensk and beyond. Budyonny's million-strong southwestern front had become a bulge that would have cost nothing to encircle and defeat, in case both tank groups undertook a connection maneuver in two converging directions. But in such a case, the withdrawal of Guderian from Army Group Center would mean the suspension of the offensive on Moscow. Hitler fully supported the Kiev option because he was convinced that, by destroying the huge group of Soviets in the south, he thus opens access to the industrial region of the Donbass and further to the oil-bearing areas of the Caucasus. In addition, he subconsciously feared to repeat in Russia the path of Napoleon, who at one time, without much thought, began to attack the Russian capital, but found himself under the strongest flank blows of the Russian army. Chief of the General Staff of the army, as well as a number of commanders of armies and tank groups of Army Group Center, believed that the direction of the main blow should be on the Moscow direction. Moscow was the political, economic, and communications center of Russia, and it was in 1941 that it became much more important in this sense. The Stalinist Empire could not withstand the loss of Moscow and would inevitably collapse. However, Hitler's point of view prevailed, and from August 8, the 2nd Panzer Group, separated from Army Group Center, began an offensive to the south. On September 12th, the 1st Tank Group struck from the bridgehead near Kremenchuk to the north, and on September 15th, the two operational compounds met near the town of Romny, east of Kiev. And when Guderian's tanks, marked G, joined with von Kleist's tanks, marked K, it meant for Budyonny's southwestern front the impossibility of holding the capital of Ukraine. The seizure of Kiev turned out to be the largest military operation in the entire military history of the time, turned out to be the encirclement of a huge army group, and the capture of 450,000 soldiers and officers of the Red Army, which opened the way for the Germans to continue the offensive deep into the Soviet Union. Keeping his diary, Hans Roth was unaware of all the strategic differences, witnessing only the fierce fighting and the gradual weakening of the Soviet resistance to the Germans during the offensive on Kiev. Roth's division was one of the first to enter the city. Quite logically, Budyonny began withdrawing his forces to the east, having realized the intentions of both tank groups, but Stalin overruled his orders and demanded that they hold to the last man. In the end, Budyonny was relieved of his post as commander of the southwestern front, and the new commander appointed by Stalin died in the Kiev cauldron. The 6th Army von Reichenau, a brilliant commander, but the most convinced Nazi in the German generalship of those operating at that time on the Eastern Front, issued very harsh orders about the treatment of the local population. Being already in Kiev, Hans Roth describes in his diary the horrors seen with his own eyes by the SD Einsatz teams. This probably refers to the infamous Babi Yar massacre. After mastering Kiev, Army Group Center took back the 2nd Tank Group. The 3rd was engaged in the north on the Leningrad section of the Eastern Front, and in early October 1941 continued the offensive on Moscow. At first it was lucky. The battles of Vyazma and Bryansk were won, but then a new ally came to the Soviets' aid, and Roth describes this as General Moroz. And in Russia, along the entire 2,000-plus kilometer front, the Germans were faced first with autumn thaw and later with severe frosts. Troop supply was practically paralyzed. Soon the fall was replaced by an early that year and unprecedentedly harsh winter. Without winter clothing, German soldiers were helpless before the terrible frosts. But the biggest trouble was that the Soviets had, it turns out, almost inexhaustible reserves transferred from the Siberian regions of the divisions, appropriately equipped to fight in the harsh winter. In December, Stalin launched a counteroffensive along the entire front. At a time when German forces were at their limit, Hitler dismissed a number of generals who demanded that German troops be withdrawn to defensive positions. This included Guderian and von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South, replacing him with von Reichenau, Hitler's most fanatical general, although Reichenau was soon convinced that his predecessor had acted correctly. Reichenau died of a heart attack after a morning jog in the bitter cold in mid-January 1942. In the winter of 1941-42, Hans Roth's anti-tank unit served as a kind of fire department, taking part in the resolution of crisis situations that constantly arose in the area, participating in battles such as for Oboyan, near the section of the railroad line between Kursk and Kharkov, on the edge of the 6th Army's offensive wedge. Having survived the winter, Hans Roth was both amazed and delighted by the spring transfer of fresh German divisions to their section of the front, but nevertheless his diary ends with an entry that speaks of his passionate desire to see his wife and daughter. September 23rd. In our rear are fierce fighting. Since the morning of September 19th, we have managed to overcome the heavily fortified ring of the outer defences of the city. The enemy, as it turned out, not so numerous and strong as we had supposed, suffered a crushing defeat in bloody battles, often turning into hand-to-hand fighting, and by 9:00 we reached the western part of the city. The Russians were no longer engaged in heavy street fighting. Our numerous advancing units attacked the citadel in the direction from Lysa Gora, and by 11:02 our swastika flags were flying everywhere. By noon we reached the center of the city. Not a single shot fired. The wide streets and squares are completely deserted, a strange and eerie sight. The silence disturbs us. It's hard to believe that such a huge city has fallen into our hands in such a short time. Or is this a Russian military trickery, an attempt to lure us into a booby trap? Could it be that we are now standing at the mouth of a volcano about to awaken? These are the questions that have been on everyone's mind. They are now being answered. In order to lure the occupation troops out of the city, which by all means had to be spared from participation in the fighting, on September 17th, the German command simulated an attack east of Kiev, conducting a thorough artillery preparation. Budyonny immediately issued an order to deliver us a crushing counterattack, while withdrawing troops from well-equipped defensive positions and, accordingly, exposed the approaches to the city. About 120 kilometers to the east of a fairly thin line of defense of the Germans, on the site of a false operation, located intending to bypass the flank of the enemy army. Intoxicated by such an easy victory, they did not meet any resistance at all. Budyonny's troops continued to pursue the retreating Germans. Those further and further retreated to the east, and by September 19th were already very far from Kiev. At that moment the fate of several 100,000 of Budyonny's fighters was decided, and they were surrounded. This is the irony of fate. Budyonny, who to the last had no doubts about victory, was convinced that he was pursuing a panic-stricken, retreating enemy, but the enemy mysteriously vanished overnight. A minor skirmish occurred only on one of the flanks of the corps. But, despite this, the Red Commander decided that he had cut the enemy group into pieces, most likely the fatal role played by the disgusting communication. What was the notorious western line of defense, on which Budyonny so counted? As in his time, the French on the Maginot Line. It was not an ordinary chain of pillboxes, no, it was a collection of diabolical resources, the result of an idea that could only originate in a mentally deranged. I will try to tell you about these ghastly dead zones which we passed during the fighting on the 17th, 18th and 19th. In the rear of Gatnoy there are fields of cooperatives, vast vegetable fields, lying in the sun. Who would think that there are high-voltage wires in these harmless vegetable beds? On top of the vegetables there are frequent mesh wires several kilometers long. There are also tall, insulated metal poles painted green. In short, a death-killing high-voltage network fed from the pillbox. It is so skillfully camouflaged that we discovered it only after the loss of several of our comrades. And then there were the Devil's Pits, deep and arranged in rows several hundred meters long. All of them are mined, and in a special way. When one mine is detonated, all the others are triggered, connected underground by special detonation channels. Simultaneously with the mines, water pipes explode, and a few minutes later the whole area is flooded. This can also be attributed to the inconspicuously stretched wire, also triggering the mines. You trip over it, and that's it. And the mines are about 75 centimeters high, and when they explode they spray burning oily liquid. It would be worth mentioning the sharp pegs, the ends of which are treated with potent poison. Scratched, and 10 minutes later, you die an agonizing death. All of the Above Divises are equipped with automatic flamethrowers driven by pressure. You can only imagine among all these terribly clever things are located and the usual types of weapons: 2-level pillboxes, racks with reinforced on them automatic machine guns, anti-tank ditches, mined paths. We should add anti-personnel mines, booby traps, ball mines, and other types of mines. And imagine how all this devilry functions under combat conditions. This is how the Russians decided to defend themselves against our attacks. First stage fire from conventional weapons tanks, artillery, machine guns, and so on. Then the artillery of pillboxes, 76.2mm guns, field guns, 122mm long-range guns, heavy artillery, 152mm, 203mm, and finally guns mounted on railroad platforms and the heavy howitzers of the Kiev fortress. As for infantry fighting, here we counted on machine gun, rifle and machine gun fire, on all sorts of grenades, on Molotov cocktails, on booby-trapped dogs, and on many other things. It would be possible to enumerate all these cunning inventions of the Bolsheviks for a long time. However, we were partly familiar with them from the Western Front. As for incendiary grenades, they have nothing in common with ordinary grenades. From the outside it does not differ from the ordinary one, only at the bottom it has a phosphorus container. When ignited, the phosphorus explodes, scattering many splinters. He who has seen the wounds from these fragments, there is no sense to reproach inhumanity to the enemy. All this nasty stuff should have been banned by the Geneva Convention long ago, but will these red Russian pigs go for it? Molotov cocktails, or Molotov cocktails as they are called, are used in the same way as hand grenades in trench fighting. The effect is as follows. The bottle breaks on impact, the liquid in it ignites on contact with the air, the temperature is 800 to 1000 degrees Celsius, white smoke in huge quantities. Imagine that such a thing got to you on your uniform. There is an opportunity in the presence of certain additional devices and shoot these bottles as projectiles. The approximate range is up to 200 meters. By the way, the Russians also mastered the firing of limonka from guns. Booby-trapped dogs. We shot a dozen of such dogs, mostly German Shepherd dogs, in Juliany. A backpack with a charge weighing about 3 kilograms was placed on the animal's back. According to the story of one prisoner who was engaged in training of these dogs, they are designed to fight against enemy tanks. By means of a thin wooden lath placed vertically at a small angle, the detonator is activated. They are usually trained by giving them food only under the tanks, so the animals get used to the tanks and climb under them, hitting the fuse drive mechanism with the lath. I have heard from other sources that dogs are also trained to pounce on infantrymen on the march. In many sections of the Pochtovaya, the Russians used aerial mines. These mines are equipped with wings and a propeller. The mine is attached to a red balloon 1 meter across. Upon landing, the balloon immediately detaches. After the explosion of such a mine, a very deep crater is left. What I am describing here is only a tiny fraction of the total. After all, what is it compared to the other acts of this Kiev group, about which very little is known? It was supposed that all the public buildings of the city were heavily mined. Already 2 days after we had taken possession of the city, 3 barracks suddenly exploded, one of which was occupied by German soldiers. And from that day, almost hourly in the city, there was an explosion. Something necessarily blew up plants and factories, warehouses, hospitals, schools, all first exploded and later destroyed by fires. The local population began to come out and show the first signs of confidence in us. Among the Ukrainians I met a lot of nice people. Touching scenes were played out in the streets. Sometimes when a group of our soldiers appeared somewhere in the city, we were immediately surrounded by local people who smiled at us, and often even cried with joy and hugged us. Some tried to say something in bad German, and that's how we learned about the many broken fates. They were grateful to us for every piece of bread. Many had not eaten for days. By noon there were as many people in the streets as on an ordinary day of peace. Cars were rolling down the roads to the east. Troop convoys, trucks, gasoline tankers. Kiev had not seen such busy traffic. All the sidewalks were filled with Gurkhas. Suddenly, an indescribable thing happened. A terrible explosion in 3 places of the main street at once. Flames soared above the houses. Stone blocks and metal structures of ceilings flew into the air. The streets were filled with acrid smoke and the smell of burning. People scattered with screams of terror. Some of them were trampled by the crowd in panic. People tried to press themselves against the walls of the houses. With guns in hand, we tried to somehow calm the panic-stricken crowd. What happened? When the smoke cleared, we saw the terrible consequences. A wide street for 100 meters was disfigured. Where Lenin's monument had just risen, a huge crater like a volcano was gaping. The walls of 4-story houses on both sides of the roadway had collapsed. Dozens of people were trapped under the ruins. So much for peaceful serenity. A few hours later, 2 divisions that had not had time to recover from the fighting were ordered to urgently form special units. One of them was ordered to inspect the city, according to the existing plan, hastily forgotten by the retreating units of the Red Army. The task was to clear the city of dangerous elements and terrorist groups. The order was passed from unit to unit, from one unit to another. Assault sappers urgently began to search for mines laid in the buildings. The special units of the Secret Field Police and the SS were particularly quick to act. In the afternoon of the same day, they began to identify Jews. This will be described in more detail below. In the course of the investigation, it became clear. 1. A remote-controlled fuse was built into the Lenin monument. 2. Several other explosive devices of similar action were found in the city centre. Despite the measures taken, not much was learned. Most likely the building of the Museum of Ukraine was also mined. We spent the whole evening checking this monumental building. Despite the fact that the rooms were pleasantly cool, we were drenched with sweat from fatigue. No wonder, try to run around a huge building where you are at every step under the threat of death. Finally, in one of the tiny basement rooms, we heard a clock ticking. The sound came from behind the wall. No wires or additional devices, nothing at all. We spent another half-hour searching for what seemed to us like an eternity to find the infernal machine. And then we were told to evacuate the building immediately. All buildings in the vicinity were cleared of people and fortified accordingly. At exactly 10:30 p.m., this huge building exploded. 5 or 6 blocks were completely burned out overnight. And this happened not only in this place, in several places in Kiev. The raging flames rose to the sky. Explosions rattled, fires raged. The sky above the city was painted with a purple glow. September 24th. Early in the morning, field units were ordered to start cleaning up the city. Thank God, the management and guards decided to be exempted from this. We didn't sleep a wink all night, blast after blast. There wasn't a single piece of glass left in our neighborhood. We were transferred to the suburb of Nikolskaya Borshegovka. We settled down in comfortable houses, quite comfortably. God is a witness that we are not spoiled by anything, but we are not spoiled by comfort. There were even chickens and primuses, and soon there was an appetizing smell of fried meat everywhere above our improvised barracks. For a few hours we decided to forget about the damned war. But vigilance is essential. You can't let the enemy take you by surprise. Almost at midnight, another terrible explosion followed. Plaster fell from the ceiling and walls, and in some places the blast wave blew out doors. We had a piece stuck in our throats. Throwing everything down, we ran like mad into the street. A giant mushroom cloud of smoke hung over the city. Something very serious must have happened. We didn't even want to eat the appetizingly fried chicken. No one touched it. Everyone was depressed. We waited impatiently for news of the night's incident. It was only in the evening that we learned something. The command and control bodies located in the largest hotel in Kiev had blown up, along with several other administrative buildings. The flames engulfed the whole city block. Several thousand residents of the city were under the debris. Many of our people died, from ordinary soldiers to high-ranking officers. Someone told me that they also blew up a soldier's overcrowded casino. It was horrible. For the first time in a long time, soldiers who had seen enough of the nightmare of the front are sitting in the hall, watching a movie, laughing as if nothing had happened, and suddenly there is an explosion. They are torn to pieces by a suddenly activated infernal mechanism. You can't think of anything worse. September 25th. In the morning we went to Teremki with 3 soldiers. This event required special vigilance. The whole area was literally stuffed with mines. Even now, when the fighting is in the past, our positions are far from safe. An ominous silence hung over the field of death, and deceptive in the ground laid tons of dynamite, waiting for one wrong step or movement to spew out fire, smoke, and death. Responsibility is a heavy burden. I should have gone alone at my own risk. But my comrades persuaded me, and I decided to take them with me. It is still gloomy here, the traces of recent battles remind of themselves. But there is no whistling of shells and shrapnel around. At Poktovaya, too, the machine guns are silent. Who could have imagined such a thing a few days ago? My God, what a panorama. In the Teremkovsky forest, the bodies of both our enemies and foes are still lying close to each other. They've been lying here for a month and a half. Yes, this is how the Teremkovsky forest looks now, with trees and corpses split by shells and splinters. The embodiment of the nightmare of war. Damn it. There's no reason for a soldier to go here on excursions, to walk on this blood-soaked ground among wire fences on which scraps of uniforms are still hanging. Then we come to a huge pile of ruins. This is Teremki. Everything around reminds very much of the lunar landscape, craters of craters and nothing else. And here were once our positions. Then we come to the place where our comrades buried by us rest in the ground. The ground has failed in some places. It's hard to recognize anything. It would seem that here we dug a grave, put them in it, poured a mound over it, but now instead of a mound there is a hollow filled with muddy water. God, what luck that their relatives and friends don't see this nightmare. Yes, this used to be our position. Thousands of shrapnel almost to the ground destroyed them. Now we can only stand and wonder how the trenches were laid out, where the trenches were dug. It doesn't make sense that you used to run through them, sleep in them, lie curled up for 2 days, waiting for the next enemy artillery attack. It doesn't make sense that someone was lucky enough to get out of this hell alive. We drive back, silent, all immersed in thought. Goodbye, Teremki. Goodbye, our fighting comrades. It's hard to remember this place. How can we forget the horrors we experienced there? We are approaching the burning Kiev, shrouded in giant clouds of smoke. Poor city. We spared you, perhaps even to our own detriment. And now there are gigantic fires raging here. Your body is convulsing with horrible explosions, and it is not your children, but the children of Judah who have inflicted mortal wounds on you, mutilating you beyond recognition. When will this terrible war come to an end? Many people say that I see the world only in black color. No, my dear ones, it is not so. On the contrary, I see everything now in white, the color of snow, which will bury many of you. Hans, don't think, please, don't think. Don't think about anything. September 26th. The city centre is a raging ocean of flames for miles. The fires are devouring the city. 2 more city neighbourhoods had to be evacuated this morning. As a result, some 20,000 people have been left homeless. About half of them are huddled in houses on nearby streets, taking the bari essentials with them. It's a depressing sight. This morning, too, the bomb squad was blowing up parts of the streets. They couldn't do without it. The SS probe teams have their hands full. Round-the-clock interrogations and shootings. Even those who seem suspicious to them are put up against the wall in the streets, and the bodies of the dead are left lying there. People, men, women, children walk around whispering, "Nothing!" I mean, it's nothing, a corpse lying on the sidewalk, so what? We are walking right through puddles of blood. On the sidewalks, there are traces of blood everywhere, fresh and already caked. The SS Einsatz is also up to its ears in work. All Jews, without exception, are to register by noon on the 25th. Of course, not all of them followed this order, but only half of them. But in any case, none of them will leave the city Kiev is cordoned off by a tight ring of guards. This will be a day of revenge for our comrades who died from the explosions of insidiously planted mines. Today, 24 hours later, 2,000 Jews have already been sent to Jehovah. We had a long conversation with a young SS soldier from the execution team. They are engaged in liberating all the major cities we have taken from the Jewish population. They know what they're doing. These guys are killers with experience. I'm amazed. We, the frontline soldiers, did not think about what was happening in the cities we had taken when we continued to pursue the retreating enemy and moved on. The task of a frontline soldier is forward and only forward. Chase the enemy as far as possible. An SS soldier tells me about the mass shootings in Zhytomyr. Back then we were still fucking undertrained, declares a 19-year-old soldier to me, with emphasis on the word fucking. For 2 days they dug 50-meter ditches at the rate of 250 Jews per ditch. In total we finished off 1,800 Jews in Zhytomyr. Another 5,000 of them were killed earlier. Then, it was already on the 3rd day, the ditches were ready, and everyone, from small children to old men, had to strip naked. The first 250 Jews were placed on the edge of the ditch, then 2 machine guns were fired at once. After that, the next group was brought to the ditch, and they had to go down and carefully stack the dead side by side, so that there was more space. If there were gaps between the corpses, they were filled with dead children. In general, there was no time to hesitate. There should have been 1,500 people, and all had to fit in the ditch. Then machine gun bursts again, and if anyone continued to moan, they were killed. Then the next group was next in line, and so it went on until evening. There was not enough time for all of them, because there are so many Jews in this country. At first I couldn't get a word out at all. This young man was talking about everything as if it were a simple pheasant hunt. I couldn't believe it, so I told him so. He grinned and suggested we go and see for ourselves. After getting on our bikes, we rode to the city outskirts to a steep ravine. I'll try to be brief. My stomach felt strangely cold. What I saw was horrible, and it was a sight I would never forget for the rest of my life. Jews were standing on the edge of this ravine, and the soldiers lying behind the machine guns were mowing them down. The bodies of the dead fell over the edge of this ravine 50 meters down. All those who stood at the edge were swept clean. When the number of killed exceeded 1,000 people, the edge of the ravine was blown up, and the pile of dead bodies below was covered with earth. It was a good idea to blow it up. My interlocutor smiled quite boyishly. My God, my God. Without saying a word, I turned and, with a quick step, almost running towards the city. This soldier is 19 years old. After all, such events leave traces not only on the uniform but also in the soul. What will happen to him when he returns home? To his mother and his fiancée? The huge fire in the center of the city continues. New explosions, new fires. Ammunition depots are exploding. September 29th. On the road again. After a day's march, we arrive in Preluki by evening. We drive through the countryside. From time to time, we are fired from rifles by Russians, apparently from recently defended, but now already deserted positions. The defeat of the 4 encircled Red armies is a fait accompli. According to the most conservative estimates, captured 650,000 people, endless columns of them stretching past us to the west. It is even possible that these are the same fellows who have attacked us so furiously during the last few weeks. But now it's all over. Their formations are surrounded, and the ring of encirclement is drawing tighter and tighter. It would be madness not to surrender to us, otherwise we would all just be shot. September 30th. For a few days we stay in Preluki. Our task is to clear the nearby forests of the remaining Bolsheviks. By Russian standards, the living conditions are quite acceptable. If most of ours are wandering somewhere, I sit over a map and draw out tactical diagrams. The first thing I do is wash and shave thoroughly, after which I go to bed for a few hours. Dinner is soup from the field kitchen, which often goes to the starving Russians as well. unhappy people, always the same crust of stale bread, and they are happy and contented with life. I have no doubt that these people had better times many years ago, under the Tsar. Again and again I ask myself how here, in the richest region of Russia, in the breadbasket of Europe, people die of hunger and live worse than cattle. The Bolshevik criminals shamelessly deprive their people of a normal, happy life for the sake of armaments, the scale of which is unique in the world. If our motto was guns instead of oil, the Soviet Union's was no oil, no housing, only the essentials, only guns. The Bolsheviks succeeded by misleading the world about the number of guns. We underestimated both the Red leaders, their soldiers, and their armaments. Because there are so many armaments in this country that it is impossible to imagine, both in its numbers and its power, not to mention aviation, tanks, and automatic weapons. And if we talk about the Red Army soldier himself, he is a strong enemy, a stubborn, fanatical fighter, the likes of which we have never met before. A month and a half of fighting in the trenches near Kiev demonstrated both his strength and his weakness. The strength of a Red Army soldier lies in his ability to hold his defences. His natural inclinations enable him to skillfully use all the advantages of the terrain. The most outstanding quality of the Russian soldier is his stoic struggle to the last, often for fear of the commissars who are quick to reprisal. The enemy proved clever in delaying tactics, in not badly organized retreats, and, of course, in the ability to disguise his retreat. Minimization of the territory left to us is constantly being improved. The Russians are inexhaustible for inventions. Very often they use delayed action fuses with an unknown trigger time. In this sense, their mining of Kiev after the retreat is a kind of masterpiece. During these days we disarmed mines with a detonation time of up to 165 days. The Russians have shown themselves masters of constructing all sorts of imaginary objects. Their positions are impassable. Their attacks initially have the character of fanatical mass assaults. If the attack fails, they simply repeat it until they win. Their attacks are almost always preceded by intense artillery preparation, and they often attack with tank support. The time to launch the attack is either dawn or night. The infantry goes on the offensive in dense masses, often almost a parade march, and they entrench themselves very skillfully, which is evident from their positions. The Russians willingly use the tactics of guerrilla. Here, we can say, they have no equal. Partisan warfare was planned, prepared, and carried out with the direct participation of the Bolshevik leadership. Nor should we forget their artillery. Those goddamned Russian batteries, far more numerous than we had imagined. The number of guns of all different calibers seems inexhaustible. We encounter them even in the most insignificant skirmishes. The Russian arsenal includes, in addition to their types of guns, guns of almost all countries, including French, British, American, and even German, Krupp. Batteries of rocket-propelled shells are also encountered. They have ammunition always and in any quantity. Their quality is very good. A special place is occupied by incendiary shells, which I have seen in different modifications, phosphorus shells, thermite shells, which have a huge explosive power. The Russians never spare cartridges and ammunition in general. The destructive fire of Russian batteries often shoots the same object for days. There were plenty of examples of this in Teremki. During daylight hours, even an insignificant target of a messenger on a motorcycle, for example, is shelled with a huge amount of ammunition. Radio and wireless communications, here they should have been more careful. The Russians are quite experienced here. But radio is not a decisive factor because there are a lot of deceptive methods. When retreating, they often simply abandon radio equipment, including transmitters. So what if it's not important? Higher headquarters still have radio telephone communication, and at the level of regiments and battalions prevail Vestavai. It was the lack of reliable radio communication that played a negative role in their defeats. October 4. Much faster than planned, we leave Priluk on the morning of the worst. A day's march. We have to transfer to the threatened area near the village of Olshane. In Romny, I somehow lost my unit in a terrible mix-up due to the dark night. Together with Brave Zap, we wandered for several days through the terribly broken territory in search of our division, but to no avail. At the Putival-Bridge Head we see Guderian's tanks. That morning we finally find our unit 112 kilometers to the south. To describe our adventures with Zap would require a separate diary. October 5th. Again, an important but very risky order. Until the arrival of the division 45 days later, the mobile unit will have to defend Olsztyn from superior enemy forces. Before leaving this morning, several combat vehicles of the 9th Panzer Division managed to throw the enemy back a few kilometers, which gave us the opportunity to entrench. We've managed to dig only the trenches necessary for the battle. Something's brewing. You've been abandoned. The numbers are too small. We are the line of defense. We and the 2nd and 6th waves of attack. No infantry, no artillery, nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's how it is. Just like in Teremki, Russian planes are attacking us in swarms. Houses are burning down one after another. In the evening, Russians rush to attack our positions with their hurrah and fall right under the fire of our machine guns. It's obvious that the fighters are untrained. All night it was very restless. Scouts report the Russians will bring up additional troops. October. In the pre-dawn gloom, the Russians attacked us again. But this time they are not newcomers, and we had to sweat, despite the morning chill. In a cautious counterattack, we have no right to take risks. Too few men, we still managed to push back the Russians. And even take prisoners. We are dealing with the Moscow Proletarian Guard and Asians. They are full of them, and they, as the attack showed, fight desperately. Alas, we have losses, and we lose 2 of our best comrades, Lieutenants Forrester and Cole. What a shame these 2 officers are really the best of us. For the first time in the afternoon, we were honored with a visit from American bombers. With the fire of their inboard guns, they set fire to the last of the surviving huts. A little later they came again. We had to retreat to the hills in the northeast, constantly fighting off the enemy pursuing us. At the cost of nothing but incredible effort, we managed to scare off these fanatically screaming hordes. No, these are not human beings. Could it be that we've somehow travelled back to the era described in Karl May's novels? Like wild cats, they're climbing trees, shooting from completely unexpected places. Just like the Negroes in La Bellière, France, they clench long cleavers in their teeth. Sneaky, conniving Asian rabble. Gentlemen, it looks like we're in for a funeral. And just at the height of despair, a miracle happens. Reinforcements. Out of nowhere, our brave infantrymen arrive out of nowhere. In the heat of the attack, no one noticed how they got here. There are more and more of them, and section by section they join our defense. That same evening, the Bolsheviks are driven back by our counterattack. But only we can't see the enemy. The darkness is impenetrable. We again return to our abandoned positions. The infantrymen organize an intensive covering fire, which allows us even to go to sleep, and soon we are snoring in our dirty trenches and trenches. October. The weather changes. From the fields blows an icy north wind. Slowly but inevitably the cold penetrates through our thin overcoats. Our hands go numb. Olsztyn is in ruins. There is no way to find a hut where we could get warm. And it gradually begins to dawn on me. The most agonizing thing is yet to come. We are facing the most terrible enemy, the Russian winter. Tonight the Russians are not attacking, so the night passes quietly. October 8th. It has become unbearably cold. With an icy north wind, it began to snow. In such terrible weather there is nothing to think about any operations. But be that as it may, in the evening our assault groups move forward. The roads turn into rivulets of liquid mud. The vehicles barely move forward. Without meeting the enemy, we reach Nedrigailov. On the roads there are dead horses, abandoned cars, burnt-out tanks, everywhere torn to shreds, uniforms, ammunition and shells trampled in the mud. Immediately behind Nedrigailov, we meet the 165th Infantry Division on the march. The division is attacking in the neighbouring area, and we have to defend one of its open flanks. With the coming of night, we put up something like a yurt out of snow bricks and wait for the Bolsheviks to attack. But nothing happens, apparently. The enemy retreated quite far. October 9th. We pursue the retreating enemy in the direction of Sumy. October 10th. Constant snowfalls mixed with rain do not allow us to move forward. Yesterday evening we arrived in Kravino, probably Krovnoye, Sumy region. Ed. The rain turned the trenches into lakes. On the radio we heard about the victorious battle to encircle the enemy in the area of Vyazma and Bryansk. The fate of the eastern campaign is practically decided. The remnants of the Red Army on the threshold of total annihilation, the Bolshevik leadership fled Moscow. Is this really their end? More and more often one hears about it on the radio, and at home, for sure, this news is on the front pages of newspapers. My thoughts are confused in my head. Has our command gone crazy overnight? It's not true. It can't be true. We see everything. We see what's going on here. Are these gentlemen sitting in blinders? What do they think in our homeland? Our wives, mothers, brides? They must be crazy with happiness, crying tears of joy that this nightmarish bloodbath will be over in a few days. And their sons, husbands, and fiancés will be back by Christmas at the latest? My God, but the reality is quite different. The troops on the Eastern Front are facing a colossal test of strength. We Germans are not used to fighting in winter, in freezing cold, and in such mud. Maybe it's really time to use barbaric weapons, to poison them. In the homeland there will be a terrible awakening from the illusions that have seized everyone. A few more weeks will pass, and all the newspapers will be covered with black crosses, which has never happened before. October 11th. And again a terrible snowfall, and all of a sudden it's -7 degrees Celsius. The roads are petrified. We could have started the offensive, we could have, if there had been fuel. And the gasoline trucks are still a long way off, sitting up to their bumpers in frost-bitten mud.